Under the vaulted ceilings of the alien throne hall, the banners of conquered worlds hung heavy with silence, and the great alien king reclined upon a chair carved from black stone that shimmered like the surface of a dark star. Before him stood the human, a warrior whose scars told stories of battles against beasts and machines, a man who had entered the hall not with fear, but with the same steady gaze that had carried him through countless struggles. The air was thick with incense, the murmurs of alien courtiers echoing from every corner, their many eyes watching the human with both awe and contempt. He had just defeated the champion of the royal court, an armored giant of scales and steel, a duel no outsider had ever survived. Blood still clung to his blade, proof that his victory was no accident of chance but the mark of one who knew how to wrestle with death itself and return breathing. The alien king leaned forward, his voice rolling like thunder across the chamber, offering promises of riches beyond imagining. He spoke of mountains of gold, rivers of jewels, ships that could bend light and space, all to be placed at the human's feet as reward for his defiance and courage. The court gasped in admiration, for even the king seldom lowered himself to generosity, and yet here he was offering treasures that could buy the loyalty of empires. The expectation was clear. The human would bow, would kneel, and would accept wealth and honor that no mortal from a fragile world like Earth could resist. Yet the man did not bend, did not lower his eyes. Instead, his gaze wandered away from the glitter of treasure and power. He looked to the shadows near the edge of the throne room, where chains clinked faintly with the movement of a frail figure half hidden from the light. There she was, a girl draped in rags that were once royal cloth but now little more than tatters, her limbs thin from centuries of confinement, her wrists bound by chains so old that rust ate into the stone beneath her. Her hair hung like a curtain, silver streaked with time, and her eyes when they met his were not of hatred but of exhaustion, of sorrow that stretched across generations. She had been there so long that many in the court no longer remembered her crime. They only knew she was to remain shackled until the end of days. The human's heart tightened, for in her he did not see a curse but a soul suffocating under the weight of forgotten years. Slowly, deliberately, he raised his hand and pointed not at the piles of gold, nor at the jeweled crown the king's servants carried forward, but at the girl in chains. The chamber erupted in laughter, a cruel mocking sound from the courtiers who believed they understood the measure of men. Some sneered that the human was a fool. Others whispered in fear that no one should dare speak for the prisoner, for she was marked by history as dangerous, cursed, and untouchable. The king's smile faded, his amusement replaced with cold curiosity as he leaned closer to the human. "You want her," the king said, his voice low, cutting through the noise. "She has been chained for 200 years, forgotten and left to rot. You would choose her over wealth, over dominion, over everything I offer?" The human did not falter. His voice was steady, every word ringing with defiance as he answered, "Yes, I choose her." A silence fell heavy upon the throne hall, the kind of silence that comes before storms, the kind of silence that carries the weight of history bending in new directions. The alien king's eyes narrowed, his expression unreadable, torn between fury and fascination. To choose chains over crowns, to choose a frail figure over the riches of galaxies, was madness to all who watched. And yet in that moment, the human's choice carved itself into the bones of the court. For the first time in centuries, the girl lifted her head fully, her gaze steady, and in her eyes burned not just sorrow but the faintest spark of something long buried, hope. The king leaned back slowly, a deep rumble shaking his chest, and with a single gesture he silenced the restless courtiers. "So be it," he declared, though his tone carried a storm yet to come. "You may have her, but you will learn why she was left in chains." And with that decree the chains trembled. The girl's fate was pulled from the shadows into the light, and the path of the human who had chosen her over gold began to unfold. A path that none in the chamber could have predicted, not even the king upon his dark throne. The sound of chains being struck loose echoed like thunder in the throne. Hall and the courtiers recoiled as if the very stones of the palace might swallow them for what had just been allowed. The girl staggered forward as the shackles fell away for the first time in 2 centuries, and her thin frame trembled under the sudden absence of their cruel weight. She had forgotten what it was to move without the pull of iron, and her legs nearly gave way. Yet when the human stepped forward and caught her, she clung to him with a grip that revealed more strength than her frail body should have held. Gasps and whispers surged through the gathered aliens as they watched the impossible, for no prisoner had ever been released from the king's decree, and no human had ever dared to demand such a thing. The alien king's eyes followed every moment, his face carved from stone giving nothing away. The human spoke no words of thanks to the king, nor bowed in humility for what he had been granted. Instead, he guided the girl gently to her feet, his arm steadying her as though she were something precious that might break at the slightest touch. She tried to speak, her voice a hoarse whisper that cracked with disuse, but the words died in her throat and she only shook her head, tears spilling unbidden down her cheeks. The courtiers muttered among themselves, their voices filled with venom and suspicion, some warning that she would bring ruin, others insisting that the king had allowed a great danger to rise again. Rumors long buried clawed their way back to life in hurried whispers, stories of a girl who had once wielded powers forbidden to her kind, a girl whose name had been erased from songs and histories alike. The human ignored their words and led her out of the hall into the long corridors of the palace, where the guards followed at a wary distance. Every step seemed a battle for her, but she refused to collapse now that freedom was within reach. They reached a quiet chamber where a basin of water and simple food had been left for her, not out of kindness but because the king wished to see how she would act once free. The human knelt beside her as she drank greedily, her hands shaking, and when she finished she looked at him with eyes wide and haunted. At last her voice came soft and unsteady but clear enough. She asked him why he had chosen her, why he had not taken the gold and the treasures that would have made him a ruler among men. He answered simply that no treasure had ever looked back at him with eyes that begged for life. His words broke something inside her that had been frozen for centuries, and she wept openly, her body shaking as the memories long buried began to stir. Between broken breaths she revealed fragments of her past. Not yet the whole truth, but shards sharp enough to draw blood. She had been a guardian once, a keeper of secrets older than the throne itself, but betrayal had torn her world apart. The king's ancestors had feared her knowledge, feared what she carried within, and so they chained her in silence, erasing her name from history so that only the myth of her curse remained. The human listened without judgment, and though the weight of her story was heavy, he felt only a deeper resolve to stand by her. But even as she spoke, shadows moved beyond the chamber. The courtiers who had watched with venom in their eyes were already spreading word through the palace. Servants whispered warnings, guards exchanged nervous glances, and everywhere the same question grew louder. Why would the king allow the release of a prisoner bound for 200 years? The king himself sat in silence upon his throne, watching, waiting, his mind turning like the slow grind of mountains. He knew the human had set events into motion that could not be undone, and though he allowed it for now, the storm gathering in his eyes promised that the price of defiance had only just begun. For the girl, every breath of freedom was a battle against the weight of centuries. Yet with the human beside her, she no longer carried it alone. For the human, every choice pulled him deeper into a struggle he did not yet understand. But his heart knew that what he had done was right. In the quiet of that chamber, under the gaze of unseen eyes, the bond between them began to grow, fragile yet unbreakable, a spark that would soon blaze into fire. The palace did not sleep that night, and though the torches burned as they always did, there was an unease in the air as if the very walls carried whispers of what had happened in the throne hall. Servants hurried with downcast eyes, guards shifted uneasily at their posts, and rumors traveled faster than footsteps through marble corridors. In a quiet chamber far from the court, the human kept watch beside the girl who now lay resting upon a bed of silks that had not touched her skin in centuries. She stirred often in her sleep, sometimes murmuring words in an ancient tongue, sometimes clutching the air as though still bound in chains. The human did not close his eyes, for he knew freedom carried dangers as sharp as the shackles she had worn. When dawn came, she awoke, and the human offered her food and water once more. Her voice was stronger now, though still soft, and she thanked him with a faint smile that carried both gratitude and sorrow. She asked him again why he had chosen her when he could have left the palace a lord among men. He told her that gold could not erase the emptiness he had seen in her eyes, and that no jewel could shine brighter than the will to live. For a long moment she looked at him as if weighing his soul, and then she spoke words she had not spoken in 2 centuries. She told him her name. It was a name that once commanded respect across worlds, a name erased from history, but when she said it aloud, it carried the strength of someone reclaiming her place in the universe. The human repeated her name softly, and she felt tears sting her eyes. For to hear it spoken after so long was to be reminded that she was more than a prisoner. She began to tell him pieces of her story. She had been a guardian of knowledge, entrusted with secrets that the ancestors of the king had sought to control. When she refused to surrender what was not theirs to command, they branded her as dangerous, a being too powerful to be allowed to walk free. They chained her and spread tales of her curse so that fear would silence questions. For generations she had endured darkness and solitude, her only company the echo of chains against stone. The human listened, and though he did not yet understand the full weight of her words, he knew that she spoke truth. He had seen in the king's eyes not just contempt, but fear. The kind of fear rulers feel when faced with something they cannot bend to their will. Yet even as she spoke, he noticed how the guards at the door shifted uncomfortably, how servants came and went more frequently than necessary. The palace was watching, waiting for her to falter, ready to pounce should she reveal something dangerous. As the day wore on, the alien king summoned the human once more. The girl was forbidden from leaving her chamber, though she clutched at his hand before he departed, her eyes pleading that he not abandon her. He promised he would return and stepped into the great hall where the king sat in silence. The courtiers whispered among themselves, their eyes gleaming with malice. The king's voice filled the room like rolling thunder. He spoke of dangers that could not be contained, of power buried beneath centuries of silence. He warned the human that by releasing the girl he had set loose something that could doom entire worlds. Yet the human did not flinch. He answered that a life spent in chains was a crime greater than any fear of what might come. The king's gaze darkened, and for a long moment the hall was silent. Then he dismissed the human with a wave of his hand, but his words followed like shadows. He said that the chains of the past had been broken, but chains of the future would be forged in blood if the girl's truth came to light. The human left with those words burning in his mind. Yet when he returned to her chamber and saw her waiting, fragile but unbroken, he felt only the certainty that he would stand with her no matter what storms were gathering. That night, as the palace whispered and plotted in the dark, the girl sat beside him, and for the first time in 2 centuries she laughed, faint and trembling but real. It was a sound the walls had not heard in lifetimes, a sound that promised that hope could bloom even in the shadow of fear. And though neither of them yet knew the battles ahead, the bond between them grew stronger, a bond that even the alien king with all his power could not easily sever. The days that followed were heavy, with tension, for the court of the alien king did not easily accept what had been done, and though no one dared speak defiance, to his face the courtiers whispered, in hidden corners and behind veiled curtains. They watched the girl carefully, and every small movement she made was reported back to the king. Servants carried rumors from chamber to chamber that her eyes glowed faintly in the dark, or that her voice carried echoes of forgotten tongues, and though none could prove such claims, the fear that surrounded her grew with each passing day. The human remained always by her side, guiding her through the labyrinthine halls of the palace where curious eyes followed and jealous voices murmured. The girl began to regain her strength little by little, and though her body still bore the weakness of centuries, in chains her mind sharpened quickly. She asked questions about the world outside, about how the stars had changed, about what empires had risen and fallen while she was locked away. The human told her of ships that crossed galaxies in days and of wars fought on planets she had never heard of. And though sadness touched her eyes at all that she had lost, she also carried a spark of wonder that had not been extinguished. At night, when the palace slept, she would sit by the window of her chamber and whisper her memories of the past to the human. Stories of ancient guardians and knowledge kept safe from those who would abuse it. It was during one such night that she revealed more of the truth. She told him that her chains had not been meant merely to contain her body, but to bind the knowledge she carried within. She had been chosen by her people to protect something sacred, a force that could bend the will of worlds if ever unleashed. The ancestors of the alien king had demanded it from her, but she had refused, and for that defiance they had condemned her to endless silence. The human listened and felt the weight of her words, yet he did not look at her with fear, as so many others would have. Instead, he told her that if the choice came again, he would still have freed her, because no power, no matter how dangerous, justified eternal chains. The next morning, the alien king summoned both of them to the throne hall. The courtiers gathered in great numbers, their many eyes glittering with anticipation, for they had waited to see how the king would address the storm that had been unleashed. The king spoke with a voice like stone grinding against stone, declaring that the girl was a relic of a past that had nearly destroyed their worlds. He said that the power she carried had once burned across the stars, and that it had taken entire fleets to bring her people down. He turned his gaze upon the human and warned him that by standing with her he had tied his fate to a blade that would one day cut him down. The human answered with calm defiance that chains had never kept the universe safe, only the courage to do what was right. His words rippled through the court like a shockwave, some sneering at his arrogance while others felt a stirring of unease that perhaps the human spoke a truth they had long forgotten. The girl stepped forward then, her voice soft yet carrying across the chamber, and for the first time since her release she spoke openly to the court. She did not deny the power she held, but she declared that it was not meant for destruction, but for protection. That she had been betrayed because she refused to surrender it to tyrants who would twist it into a weapon. The courtiers erupted into argument, some shouting that she was lying, others whispering that her words sounded like the truth of legends. The alien king raised his hand and silence fell once more, his eyes burning with a storm of emotions. He told her that the past could not be rewritten, and that the blood of her people still stained the stars. He told the human that by choosing her, he had declared himself an enemy of the crown should her power ever awaken. Yet even with the threat laid bare, the human did not falter, and when he placed his hand gently upon the girl's shoulder, the entire court saw that his loyalty was unshakable. That night the palace trembled with unrest, factions forming in shadowed halls, some calling for the girl's death before her strength could return, others whispering that perhaps she was the key to a future no king could control. The alien king sat alone upon his throne, his thoughts a storm without end, knowing that the choice he had allowed had set his empire upon a path that could no longer be turned aside. And in the quiet of their chamber, the human and the girl sat side by side, watching the stars through the window, knowing that the chains of the past were broken, but that the chains of destiny were only beginning to tighten around them both. The palace grew darker with every passing day, though the torches still burned and the music of the court still played faintly in the grand halls. There was a tension that could not be brushed away, for the release of the chained girl had split the court into two unseen factions. Some whispered that she was a danger that must be erased before she regained her strength, while others began to question why she had been silenced at all. The human walked those halls with her always close by, and wherever they went eyes followed, some full of hate and some full of fear, but a few carrying the first glimmer of sympathy. It was not the treasure of gold that threatened the throne now, but the treasure of truth hidden behind her name and her history. At night, when the shadows stretched long across their chamber, she spoke to him more openly than ever before. She told him of the betrayal that had sealed her fate 2 centuries ago, how she had been tricked into the palace under promises of peace and then shackled without trial. She had begged for her voice to be heard, but the rulers of that age had silenced her and painted her as a monster to justify their fear. Her people had been scattered across the stars, their voices erased from the songs of history, and she had been left as the last echo of a civilization that once guarded knowledge too dangerous for the greedy. The human listened, and with each word his anger grew not at her, but at the injustice that had bound her for so long. He swore that no chain would ever be placed on her again as long as he still breathed. The alien king did not remain idle. He sent envoys in secret to the human's chamber, offering him riches once more if only he would abandon the girl. They promised command of fleets, planets ripe for the taking, and eternal honor among the stars. But the human turned them all away without hesitation. Word of his refusal spread quickly through the palace, and with it, the certainty that he could not be swayed. It was then that the whispers turned to darker plots. Courtiers hired assassins from the shadows of the empire, killers trained to end lives without trace, and one night blades glimmered in the dark as figures crept into the chamber where the girl lay asleep. But they found the human waiting, and steel clashed with steel in silence until the assassins lay broken upon the marble floor. The girl awoke in terror, but when she saw the human standing over her, with his blade still in hand, she knew the truth of his vow. She wept again, not from sorrow, but from the strange warmth of hope, a warmth she had thought forever dead. She told him that her heart no longer carried only memories of chains, but also the fragile beginnings of trust. He answered not with words, but by placing his hand gently over hers, steady and certain. The next day the king summoned him in fury. The hall shook with his voice as he accused the human of defying his mercy and stirring rebellion. He claimed that the girl's presence had already poisoned the minds of the court, and that the blood spilled by the assassins was proof of her curse. But the human stood firm and declared before the entire court that it was not she who poisoned their hearts but the lies that had bound her. He said that fear had silenced truth for too long and that no ruler, not even a king, could chain it forever. The court erupted into chaos with voices shouting for execution and others calling for clemency. The king's eyes blazed with a fury that could have burned stars. He promised that if the girl's power ever awoke fully, he would unleash the wrath of his empire upon them both. Yet behind his rage there flickered something else, the unmistakable shadow of fear. The human saw it and knew the king's throne was no longer unshakable. That night the palace was alive with secret meetings and whispered oaths. Some plotted to end the girl before dawn. Others dreamed of following her into a new age. The human and the girl sat together by the window where the stars burned bright, and for the first time she confessed that her chains had not only bound her body, but had held back the power that still lingered within her. She feared it, and yet she felt it stirring as if the centuries of silence had only made it more eager to be heard. The human did not step back in fear, but told her that if the time came, he would face it with her. In that moment, the bond between them deepened into something even the alien king could not break, and the palace walls seemed to tremble with the weight of destiny pressing closer. The palace could no longer hide the storm that had been gathering. Whispers had grown into arguments and arguments into open defiance. The release of the girl had split the court into camps that eyed one another with suspicion and hate. The alien king felt his throne shake beneath him, not from outside invaders, but from the turmoil within his own walls. His fury smoldered like fire contained in stone, waiting for the moment to break free. He summoned the human and the girl to the throne hall once more, and this time the chamber was not filled with curiosity, but with the sharp edge of dread. Guards lined the walls in greater numbers, their weapons gleaming in the torchlight, and courtiers pressed close together like predators circling prey. The king's voice rolled out heavy and merciless. He declared that enough was enough, that the girl's very presence had poisoned his court and threatened the balance of his reign. He accused her of weaving lies to ensnare the human and of reviving an ancient curse best left buried. His words struck the air like hammers, but when the girl stepped forward, she did not shrink from his fury. Her voice was steady as she told him that he feared not a curse but the truth of his lineage. A lineage built on betrayal and chains. The human stood at her side, his hand resting lightly upon the hilt of his blade, and when he spoke his words cut sharper than any weapon. He said that a ruler who chained the innocent and silenced truth was no king but a coward hiding behind fear. The hall erupted into chaos. Courtiers shouted for her death, others demanded proof of her words, and a few dared to call for her freedom. The king's face darkened like a storm at sea, and he raised his hand, giving the command no one had thought he would. He ordered her execution on the spot. The guards advanced, their steps heavy and final, but before they could reach her, the human drew his blade. The steel gleamed under the torchlight, and the first guard fell before he even understood what had happened. Gasps filled the chamber as the human placed himself fully between the girl and the king's wrath. The battle that followed shattered the silence of centuries. Guards surged forward in waves, their weapons clashing against the human's sword as he fought with the ferocity of one who knew he could not falter. Each strike was fueled by the oath he had sworn, that no chain would ever bind her again. The girl stood behind him at first, fear and sorrow twisting within her. But as the clash raged, she felt something stir deep inside. The power that had been buried by 2 centuries of silence began to awaken. Her eyes glowed faintly, her breath came with a strange rhythm, and the air around her seemed to hum as if the universe itself remembered her name. The alien king watched with a mixture of fury and dread as the girl lifted her hands. Light rippled through the hall, not the fire of destruction but the raw force of truth unveiled. Chains that had been broken now shattered completely, their memory erased. The guards hesitated, fear seizing their limbs, and in that pause the human struck them down one by one until the floor was slick with defeat. The courtiers shrank back, their whispers turning into cries of terror, for they saw that the power they had buried was not gone but alive and burning brighter than ever. The king rose from his throne, his own blade forged of black metal older than empires gripped tight in his hand. He advanced with the weight of his crown behind him, each step echoing with centuries of rule. He told the girl that she was a curse reborn and that he would end her with his own hand. But the human moved to meet him, their blades colliding with a sound that shook the very pillars of the hall. Sparks flew, steel ground against steel, and for the first time the king found himself matched blow for blow by one who had no crown. No riches, no armies, only unbreakable resolve. The girl's power surged higher, her chains no longer binding her soul. She raised her voice in a cry that pierced through stone, a cry not of vengeance but of freedom, and the light that burst from her shattered the shadows clinging to the hall. The courtiers fell silent, blinded by the brilliance, and in that silence the truth of her existence stood undeniable. She was no monster. She was the living proof of a crime committed by rulers who had feared what they could not control, and beside her stood the human who had chosen her over all the wealth of the stars. As the clash between human and king raged, the fate of the throne and perhaps of worlds beyond it balanced on the edge of every strike. The girl, no longer a prisoner, no longer forgotten, prepared to wield the full measure of the power that had been denied her for so long. And in the fire of that moment she knew that the final choice would not be hers, alone but shared with the human who had set her free. The throne hall shook as if the stones themselves trembled under the weight of destiny. The clash between the alien king and the human filled the chamber with thunderous echoes, each strike of steel against steel a drumbeat of defiance and fury. Courtiers pressed themselves against the walls, their many eyes wide in terror, for never had they seen their ruler pressed so hard by a lone warrior. The king's blade was black as night, forged from a star's death, and it tore through the air with a speed that left streaks of shadow in its wake. The human met every blow with unyielding strength, his muscles burning, his breath ragged, yet his eyes never left the king's. Unflinching in the storm, the girl stood behind him, the glow in her eyes burning brighter with each passing moment. The power she had carried within for 2 centuries surged now like a river freed from a dam. She felt fear at its immensity, for it was vast and wild, but she also felt the steadiness of the human's presence, the anchor that kept her from being swept away. With trembling hands she raised her arms and light spilled from her fingertips, weaving through the air like threads of dawn. The chains of memory and silence that had bound her for so long shattered completely, and she felt whole for the first time since before the betrayal. The king roared in fury, his blade striking with renewed force as he sensed her awakening. He promised to cut her down to end the curse before it could spread, but the human sword blocked his path again and again. Blood trickled from wounds on the human's arms and shoulders, yet he pressed forward with a ferocity that even the king could not match forever. The courtiers watched with bated breath, caught between their fear of the girl's power and their awe of the man who fought their sovereign to a standstill. At last the king struck with such force that the human was thrown back against a pillar, his blade nearly torn from his grasp. The king advanced, his black sword raised high, ready to deliver the final blow. But before it could fall, the girl stepped forward. Her voice rang clear and strong, carrying across the hall like the toll of a bell. She told the king that he had stolen her years, but he would not steal her future. She told him that his reign built on chains and silence was ending. The power within her surged, not as fire meant to burn, but as light meant to reveal. It poured forth in a wave that struck the king, halting him in his path. The human rose once more, bloodied but unbroken, and with a cry that shook the rafters he lunged forward. His blade met the king's in a final clash, and with the girl's light blazing around them, the black sword shattered into fragments. The alien king staggered, his power broken, his fury collapsing into disbelief. The human's sword struck true, driving him back onto his own throne where he collapsed. His reign ended not by armies but by the defiance of one man and the freedom of one girl. The hall fell silent. The courtiers stared at the fallen king, their voices stolen by shock. The girl's light dimmed slowly, her body trembling with exhaustion, but she did not fall. She turned to the human and saw him standing, weary but alive, his blade still steady in his hand. In that moment she knew her future was no longer chained to darkness. She crossed the hall and took his hand, lifting it high before the court. Her voice declared not vengeance but freedom, not destruction but the chance to build anew. The courtiers, still trembling, bowed their heads one by one, for they saw that the age of fear had ended. The human looked at her, and though he had chosen her over gold without knowing what she truly was, he felt no regret. She looked back at him, and though she could have unleashed her power to rule or to destroy, she instead asked him quietly what path they should take. He told her that the universe did not need more chains but more hope, and she smiled for the first time in centuries, a smile not of sorrow but of life. Together they walked from the throne hall, leaving the shattered crown and the broken sword behind. The stars awaited them, and though the path ahead was uncertain, it would be theirs to shape. The courtiers watched them go, silent and humbled, for they knew that legends were being written in their sight. The girl, once chained for 200 years, was free, and the man who had chosen her over all the treasures of the galaxy walked beside her into a dawn that promised a future unbound. The ruins of the throne hall still smelled of smoke and steel as the human and the girl stepped into the open air beyond the palace walls. The night sky stretched above them, alive with stars that seemed to burn brighter than ever before. Behind them the court whispered in fear and awe, but none dared follow. The alien king's reign had ended not with the march of armies, but with the breaking of chains and the courage of a single choice. The girl's steps were unsteady, yet each one was stronger than the last, for she no longer carried the weight of iron. She breathed deeply, tasting freedom in every breath, and for the first time in 2 centuries she felt the wind on her skin, without the sting of shackles. The human walked. At her side, his blade still streaked with the fight that had nearly cost him his life, yet his eyes were fixed only on her. He had not chosen her for power or reward, and now that the truth of her existence had come to light, he felt no regret. She looked at him with a gaze filled not with sorrow but with gratitude and something more, a bond forged in battle and in trust that no force in the galaxy could sever. Together they crossed the courtyard, and the guards who had once raised weapons against them now bowed their heads, for the weight of truth had broken their loyalty to a throne built on lies. They moved through the city beyond the palace walls, and the people stirred from their homes to watch. Whispers filled the streets as the girl, who had been nothing more than a cursed story, walked among them, alive and radiant. Some knelt, some wept, and some simply stared, unable to comprehend the sight. She did not raise her hand to command them, nor did she speak words of vengeance. Instead, she lifted her head to the stars and let the silence carry the promise that chains would never bind her again. The human stopped at the edge of the city, where the road opened to the plains beyond, and there he turned to her. He asked what she would do now that the past had been broken and the future stood waiting. She answered that for 200 years she had known only the walls of her prison, but now she wished to see the worlds that had risen while she slept. She wished to walk among the stars, not as a prisoner, but as one who had been given back her life. The human nodded and told her that wherever she chose to go, he would go with her. Her smile in that moment was brighter than all the gold the king had once promised. Together they left the city behind, their figures small against the vast horizon, but their steps unshaken. The palace stood silent behind them, no longer the heart of power, but the tomb of a fallen reign. The courtiers who had once whispered in fear now whispered in reverence, for legends were not written by crowns or thrones, but by choices that defied them. The girl who had been chained for 2 centuries and the man who had chosen her above riches walked into the dawn of a new age, carrying with them the truth that no chain is stronger than the will to be free. The end.